They locked her in the barn before the sun even touched the hills, and by morning, no one in town would dare go near that door. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe justice doesn't always come with a gun, stay with me. The town of Dry Creek had seen strangers before, drifters, traders, men chasing gold or running from something they wouldn't name. But the woman who rode in that afternoon didn't fit any of those stories. She came slow along the ridge on a tired horse that limped every third step, her back straight despite the miles, her dark hair tied with a strip of faded leather. And when she reached the well at the center of town, she didn't ask for food, didn't ask for shelter, just water, one bucket. Nothing more, and that alone unsettled people more than if she had begged, because quiet always made folks imagine things worse than truth. Caleb Whitmore was the only one who stepped forward, boots heavy in the dust, hat low against the sun. He didn't ask her name, didn't question where she came from, just pulled the rope and filled the bucket, setting it down beside her with a nod that meant respect without surrender. And for a moment, the town held its breath, because kindness in a place like Dry Creek always came with a cost. She knelt beside the horse first, letting it drink before she took a single sip herself, her hand resting along its neck, whispering something too soft to hear, and Caleb noticed the way the animal calmed, like it understood her, like pain wasn't the only thing it felt anymore. And that's when he saw it, the small object hanging from her neck, a worn piece of turquoise wrapped in silver wire, catching the light just enough to make him look twice, though he couldn't say why. By sundown, the horse lay still behind the saloon, and the whispers began, quiet at first, then louder, carried through open doors and across wooden porches, words like curse, bad luck, wrong kind of woman, and nobody said it outright. But everyone felt it settle into their bones, the idea that something had followed her into town, something they didn't understand and didn't want to, and fear, once it finds a place to sit, doesn't leave easy. It didn't take long before someone decided something had to be done, not out of cruelty, at least not the kind they'd admit to, but out of that slow, creeping need to control what can't be explained. So they told themselves it was for safety, for the children, for the livestock, for peace of mind. And by the time the last light slipped behind the hills, a small group had gathered near the old barn at the edge of town, voices low, movements quick, eyes avoiding hers as they led her there, not with force, but with something colder, something quieter, the kind of judgment that doesn't need shouting. She didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even look afraid, and that unsettled them more than anything else, because people understood fear, they knew how to answer it, but calm like hers felt like something else entirely, something that didn't belong to them. When the barn door closed, the sound echoed longer than it should have, wood against wood, final in a way that made a few men shift where they stood, but no one spoke, no one stepped forward to question it. And when the first nail went in, sealing it shut, they told themselves it was done, that whatever followed her would stay locked inside, that by morning everything would make sense again. But sometime after midnight, when the wind dropped and the town lay still under a sky stretched wide with stars, Caleb woke to a sound he couldn't place, not loud, not urgent, just present, like something had changed in the air itself. And as he stepped out onto his porch, boots meeting cold wood, he noticed something that made him pause. Every horse in town stood silent, heads lowered, as if listening, as if waiting. And from somewhere beyond the edge of sight, beyond the reach of lantern, light and comfort, the ground carried the faintest tremor, not enough to shake, just enough to remind a man that some things don't need to rush to be powerful. And Caleb Whitmore, standing alone in the dark, began to understand that whatever they had locked inside that barn wasn't the thing they should be afraid of. The sound did not grow louder, but it spread, like something moving through the ground rather than across it. And Caleb stood there long enough for the night air to turn cold against his skin, long enough to notice that not a single dog barked, not a single lantern flickered, as if the entire town had slipped into a silence that was not sleep, but waiting. And somewhere behind him, beyond the row of empty stalls, the barn sat in shadow, its wooden frame dark against the pale dust, holding something everyone believed they understood, and yet no one truly did. He stepped down from the porch, slow, careful, boots pressing into dirt that felt different now, not softer, not harder, just aware, and with every step, that low sound returned, not a voice, not exactly, but something shaped like one, a rhythm carried on breath, rising and falling in a way that made the air feel heavier. And when he reached the edge of the barn, he stopped, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him knew that crossing that last few feet would change the way he saw everything after. The door remained sealed, boards nailed tight, the same way the man had left it hours before, but the space around it felt wrong, not dangerous, just full, like a room where a conversation had already begun without you. And Caleb raised a hand toward the wood, hesitating just before his knuckles touched, because beneath that faint rhythm, he heard something else, a breath that did not struggle, a presence that did not ask to be let out, and that unsettled him more than anything the others had. Whispered. He lowered his hand. Not yet. Behind him, a window creaked open somewhere in town. Then another, soft movements as others woke to the same feeling. Though none of them stepped outside, none of them came close, because distance is the easiest way to pretend you are not part of what is happening. The sky began to shift, black turning to that deep gray that comes just before morning, and with it, the air changed again, carrying something new, not sound this time, but movement, subtle at first, like wind brushing across open land, then steadier, measured, and Caleb turned toward the horizon, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of shapes forming where there had been nothing moments before. At first, he thought it was just dust, the kind that rises when cattle move far off, but there was no randomness to it, no scatter. It held together, advanced with purpose, and as the light grew, so did the shapes within it, tall, still, spaced in a way that spoke of intention, not chance. He counted without meaning to, 1, then 3, then more than he could follow, and none of them hurried, none of them broke formation, just a line stretching wider with every second, silent in a way that pressed against his chest. A door opened behind him, then another, boots stepping onto porches, voices that tried to whisper but carried anyway, and soon the edge of town filled with people who had chosen to stay back, to watch from a distance that made them feel safe, though nothing about what approached suggested safety or danger, only certainty. Caleb did not move. He stood where he was, between the barn and the road, as if something had placed him there without asking. And when the first of the riders came into full view, he saw no weapons raised, no signs of anger, only faces marked with lines of paint that did not hide expression but revealed it, calm, steady, aware, and behind them, more followed, until the horizon itself seemed to stand and watch. The sound in the ground faded as they stopped, not far from the town, not close enough to threaten, just within sight. And for a long moment, nothing happened. No one spoke, no one stepped forward, until Caleb realized that the silence was not empty at all. It was waiting, not for them, but for something behind him, something still inside that barn. And for the first time since the night began, he understood that whatever came next would not be decided by the town, not by fear, not by numbers, but by the woman they had chosen not to understand. No one gave the order, but everyone felt it at the same time, that quiet shift in the air that said something was about to be decided. And Caleb did not turn around when he heard the first nail loosen behind him, not because he was not curious, but because he already knew who would be standing there when the door finally opened. Though it gave a slow, tired creak, not forced, not broken, just released, as if it had never been meant to hold anything in the first place. And when the door moved an inch, then two, the sound carried across the empty space between the barn and the waiting riders, drawing every eye without a single word spoken. She stepped out into the early light like she had simply been resting, not confined, not shaken, her posture the same as when she had arrived, calm and steady, her hand brushing lightly along the frame as she crossed the threshold. And for a moment, no one in the town recognized what they were seeing, because they had expected something else, fear, anger, anything that would make sense of what they had done. Caleb watched her closely, the same way he had at the well, looking not for signs of threat, but for truth, and what he saw unsettled him more than anything that had come before, because there was no accusation in her eyes, no demand, just a quiet awareness that seemed to take in everything at once, the barn, the people, the riders beyond, and something deeper that no one else could name. Behind her, the stall that had held the horse stood open, and the animal that had lain still the night before now lifted its head slowly, breathing deep, its legs steady beneath it, as if the weight that had held it down had simply passed, and a murmur rippled through the town, not loud, not bold, just enough to break the silence they had been hiding behind. She did not look back at the horse. She did not need to. Instead, she stepped forward, one measured step into the open space. And that was enough to change everything, because the riders across the field moved at the same moment, not advancing, not retreating, just lowering their heads in a gesture so small it might have been missed if not for the way it echoed across the line, one after another, until the entire horizon seemed to bend in acknowledgement. No weapons lifted, no voices raised, just respect, given freely, without demand. Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, something he had not put a name to in years, not fear, not relief, something closer to understanding, though it came too slowly to hold on to. The townspeople behind him did not move. Some stared, some looked away, but none stepped forward, because whatever place they had held in this moment had already passed them by. She walked past Caleb without stopping, close enough that he could hear her breath, steady, unhurried, and for the briefest second, her gaze met his, not long, not searching, just a single look that carried more weight than any word he had heard in months. And then she was beyond him, moving toward the waiting line that had come for her not as a threat, but as something else entirely. The dust under her feet did not rise. The air did not shift. Yet every step she took seemed to draw a line between what had been done and what could no longer be undone. And still, no one spoke. Not the riders. Not the town. Not even Caleb. Because in that silence, clearer than anything else, was the truth none of them could escape, that nothing they feared had ever been inside that barn, and nothing they hoped to control had ever belonged to them. She did not hurry, and that was the first thing that unsettled them all over again, because anyone else would have walked faster under that many eyes, would have tried to explain, to defend, to justify, but she moved like time itself belonged to her, each step placed with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the moment she arrived. And as she crossed the open stretch between the barn and the waiting riders, something else became clear, something no one in Dry Creek had prepared themselves to face, that this moment was not about what she would do, but about what they had already done. Caleb remained where he stood, the space she had passed through still holding the faint trace of her presence. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of choice settle in his chest, not the kind that comes fast and loud, but the kind that builds slow, asking questions that do not let go. Behind him, the town shifted, boots scraping against wood, hands gripping railings a little tighter, and though no one spoke, the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It carried something heavier now, something closer to recognition. The riders did not move toward her. They waited, as if the distance between them was not meant to be crossed quickly, and when she reached the midpoint, she paused, just once, her head turning slightly, not toward the riders, but back toward the town, and that single glance held more weight than any accusation ever could, because it did not judge, it did not accuse, it simply saw, and being seen like that, without anger, without fear, stripped away every excuse they had built through the night. Caleb felt it settle deep, that look, and he understood something he had missed before, that the water he had given her had not been the only thing she had accepted. She had seen him too, measured him without words, and whatever she had found there had been enough to remember. The riders closest to her dismounted as one, their movements slow and deliberate, not a show of force, not a display meant to intimidate, but something older, something grounded in respect, and one of them, a man marked with lines of silver in his hair, stepped forward just enough to close the distance without breaking it, his gaze steady, his posture open, and though no words were spoken, the meaning carried clear across the still air. She was not returning, she was being received. A breeze moved through the town then, light but undeniable, carrying the scent of dust, and something else beneath it, something like sage and rain long before it arrives. And for reasons no one could explain, a few people lowered their eyes, not out of fear, but because holding her gaze any longer felt like holding on to something they had not earned. Caleb took a step forward before he realized he had decided to move, his boots crossing the line that had separated him from the others, and though he did not call out, did not raise his voice, The movement alone was enough to draw attention, a quiet choice made in full view. And for a moment, the town seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see what he would do with it. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough now to see the fine lines of dust along her hands, the steady rise and fall of her breath. And for the first time since she had stepped out of that barn, he spoke, his voice low, not to challenge, not to question, but simply to acknowledge. And the words were few, carried without weight, yet they landed where they needed to. And when she met his eyes again, there was something there now that had not been before, not approval, not forgiveness, something quieter, something like acceptance of what he had chosen in that moment. Then she turned, not away from him, but toward what waited beyond. And as she moved the final distance, the riders parted without being told, creating a path that had not existed until she stepped into it. And the town of Dry Creek watched as she left them exactly where they stood, not harmed, not threatened, but changed in a way none of them would be able to name. Because sometimes the heaviest judgment does not fall with force. It arrives in silence, and it leaves you alone with what you have become. The riders did not leave right away, and that was the second thing the town did not expect. Because people understood departure, they understood endings that came clean and quick, but this was neither. This was something that lingered, something that stayed just long enough to make every man and woman standing there feel the weight of being seen without being touched, and Alara Nahin stood among them not as someone protected, but as someone who belonged, the space around her shifting in a way that made it clear she had never been alone, not even for a moment inside that barn. Caleb remained where he had stopped, a few feet from where she had passed him, and though his body had gone still, his mind had not. It moved slow but steady, turning over everything he had witnessed, every choice made in silence, every moment where he could have stepped forward sooner and did not. And there was no anger in that realization, only a quiet understanding that some things do not ask for permission. They simply arrive and wait to see who you choose to be when they do. Behind him, someone finally spoke, not loud, not confident, just enough to break the hold that had settled over the town. A single voice asking what now, and no one answered. Because for the first time, there was no simple way to return to what had been, no easy word to smooth over what had already been done. The man, with silver in his hair, stepped closer to Alara, his presence steady, grounded, and when he inclined his head slightly, she answered in the same way, not as a subordinate, not as a leader, but as something balanced between the two, a connection that did not need explanation to be understood. Then, without command, the line began to shift, not forward, not backward, but turning, slow and deliberate, as if the entire horizon had decided to move in a different direction, and the path they created opened not toward the town, but away from it, leading back across the wide stretch of land they had crossed in silence. Alara did not look back again, not at the barn, not at the people, not even at Caleb, and somehow that carried more weight than if she had, because it meant the moment had already passed for her. Whatever needed to be seen had been seen, whatever needed to be understood had been left behind. Caleb watched as she walked beside the man with silver in his hair. Their pace matched without effort, and as the distance between them grew, something unexpected settled over him. Not regret, not quite, but a recognition that the smallest actions are often the only ones that matter. And he thought of the bucket of water, of the way she had given it first to the horse, of the way she had never once asked for more than what she needed. And he understood then that what had set everything in motion had not been her presence, but the way the town had chosen to see it. A door creaked open behind him, then another, more people stepping out now, not to watch, but to breathe, to move again in a world that no longer felt as certain as it had the day before. And somewhere near the barn, a child's voice broke through, asking a question too simple for the weight it carried. Why did they come? And no one answered that either, because the truth did not sit easy in words. The last of the riders passed beyond the rise, their figures fading into the same dust that had brought them, and the ground stilled, the air lightened, but something remained, something that would not leave with them, something that had settled into the wood of the buildings, into the spaces between people, into the quiet moments that follow when there is nothing left to distract from what you know. Caleb turned then, slowly, his eyes finding the barn once more, the door hanging open now, the nails loosened and scattered at its base, and inside, The stall stood empty except for the faint impression where the horse had rested, a reminder not of what had happened, but of what had been misunderstood. He stepped closer, just enough to see the small mark on the wood where her hand had brushed as she left, and though it was nothing more than a trace, it held his attention longer than it should have, because it was proof of something simple and undeniable, that she had been real, that the moment had been real, and that whatever came next would not be shaped by what the town chose to forget, but by what it could no longer pretend it had never seen. Morning did not return to Dry Creek the way it used to. It came slower now, heavier, like the light itself had to think before settling on rooftops and dust, and people stepped outside with the same hands, the same boots, the same routines, yet nothing felt the same beneath them, because once a place has been seen clearly, it does not go back to pretending. Caleb Whitmore did not head to the well that morning, did not check the fences or the cattle. Instead, he stayed near the barn longer than any man had reason to, standing just outside the open door as if the empty space inside still had something left to say. And in a way, it did, not through sound, not through movement, but through the quiet absence of everything they had believed belonged there. The stall was clean now, cleaner than it should have been, no trace of struggle, no mark of sickness, just smooth dirt and a faint outline where something had once rested, and Caleb found himself stepping inside, slow, careful, as though crossing into a place that deserved more respect than it had been given. He ran his hand along the wood where her fingers had brushed, the grain rough beneath his skin, real, solid, undeniable, and yet what it held was something he could not measure, not in inches, not in weight, something that settled deeper than that. Outside, the town moved, not with noise, but with hesitation, voices lower than usual, conversations unfinished, people looking at one another and then away, as if each glance carried a question no one wanted to answer first. And for the first time in years, Dry Creek felt smaller, not in size, but in certainty. A man passed by the barn, then slowed, then stopped altogether, not stepping in, not speaking, just standing there long enough to acknowledge what had happened before moving on, and others followed in the same way, each one leaving with the same quiet shift in their expression, not fear, not confusion, something closer to reflection. By midday, the sun rose high, casting sharp shadows across the street, and still the town had not returned to its usual rhythm, because some things do not fade with light. They settle into it, becoming part of what you see whether you want them to or not. Caleb finally stepped back out, the open sky above him stretching wide and clear, and for a moment he looked toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, expecting nothing, and finding exactly that, an empty line of land that held no sign of what had passed through it, no dust, no tracks visible from where he stood, and yet the absence felt louder than anything he had heard the night before. He moved toward the well then, slow, deliberate, the same place where it had begun, and when he reached it, he paused, hand resting on the rope, remembering the weight of the bucket, the way she had taken it without words, the way she had given it first to something else. And he understood now that the moment had not been about kindness alone. It had been about recognition, about seeing without judgment, something the rest of the town had not chosen to do. He drew the bucket up, water glinting in the sunlight, and set it down gently, not because anyone was there to take it, but because the act itself mattered now in a way it had not before, a small thing, quiet, but real. Somewhere behind him, a voice called his name, asking what he thought had happened, asking if it was over, and Caleb did not turn right away, not because he did not hear, but because he needed a moment longer to stand in the truth of what he had come to understand, that nothing had been taken from the town that night, nothing had been given either, only revealed, and what had been revealed could not be put back behind a door, no matter how tightly it was nailed shut. When he finally turned, his expression carried no answer, only a calm that had been earned. And as he walked back through the center of Dry Creek, past the doors and windows and faces that now held something quieter than before, one thing settled clearly in the space between them all, that the fear they had felt had never been about her, and whatever came next would depend entirely on whether they chose to remember that, or pretend they never knew it at all. By late afternoon, Dry Creek had found its noise again, but not its voice. The sounds returned in pieces, a hammer striking wood somewhere down the road, a wagon wheel creaking under weight, boots crossing the same paths they always had. Yet everything felt slightly out of rhythm, like a song played just a fraction too slow, and the people moved through it carefully, as if any sudden motion might bring the silence back down over them. Caleb Whitmore noticed it in the smallest ways, in the way men paused before speaking, in the way women lingered a second longer at doorways, watching, thinking, and in the way no one walked near the barn unless they had to, not because they feared it now, but because it had become something else, something that reminded them of a moment they could not step out of. The sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the street, and Caleb found himself drawn again to the edge of town, to the place where the riders had stood that morning, not because he expected them to return, but because some part of him needed to understand the distance they had crossed without leaving a mark behind. He stood there for a while, looking out over the open land, the same miles of dust and grass and wind that had always been there, unchanged, and yet he could not shake the feeling that the land had been listening all along, that it had simply waited for the town to notice. Behind him, footsteps approached, hesitant, uneven, and when Caleb turned, he saw the man who had first suggested locking the barn, standing a few feet away, hat in his hands, eyes lowered not out of shame alone, but uncertainty, as if he no longer trusted his own judgment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the certainty it had the night before, asking if Caleb thought they had done wrong, not as a challenge, but as a question that had nowhere else to go. Caleb did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because the truth did not belong to him alone, and he understood now that answers given too easily are the ones people forget the fastest. Instead, he looked back toward the horizon, letting the quiet stretch between them, and after a long moment, he spoke in a tone that held no weight of authority, only clarity, saying that what mattered was not what they had done, but what they chose to do now that they knew better, and the man nodded slowly, not because it solved anything, but because it left him with something he could not ignore. As the evening settled in, more people gathered near the well, not out of habit, but because it felt like the only place where something honest might still be said, though no one seemed ready to speak it aloud, and Caleb watched them from a distance, seeing the way their eyes moved, not searching for answers anymore, but searching for each other, as if understanding would have to be built between them now, piece by piece. A child stepped forward, the same one who had asked the question earlier, and looked up at the adults with a kind of quiet persistence that only children carry, asking again why the woman had not been afraid, and this time, the silence that followed felt different, not empty, but full, as if the answer was already there, waiting to be recognized. Caleb found himself stepping closer, not to lead, not to teach, but simply to stand where he could be heard, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all day, steady, without hesitation, saying that maybe she had not been afraid because she had nothing to prove, because she knew who she was before she ever set foot in their town, and that the fear they had seen had not been hers at all, but their own, reflected back at them in a way they could not turn away from. The child listened, then nodded, not fully understanding, but accepting it in the way that matters most, and as the light faded and the first stars appeared overhead, something shifted again in Dry Creek, not a return to what it had been, but the beginning of something else, something quieter, something harder, a kind of awareness that would not leave with the morning, and Caleb Whitmore, standing among them without standing above them, realized that whatever story the town would tell itself, after this day, it would never again be able to pretend it had not seen the truth when it stood right in front of them and chose to walk away without saying a word. That night did not settle the way nights usually did in Dry Creek. It stretched longer, quieter, as if the darkness itself had something left to say before it allowed anyone to rest. And though the lamps were lit and doors were closed, sleep came slow to most, drifting in and out like a thought that refused to stay still. Because once a truth finds its way into a place, it does not leave when the sun goes down. It waits, patient, for the moment you stop trying to ignore it. Caleb Whitmore sat on the edge of his porch, hat resting beside him, hands folded loosely as he looked out over the empty street, not searching for anything, not expecting anyone, just letting the stillness settle around him in a way that felt different now, less like solitude, more like space. And in that space, memories moved quietly, the sound of the barn door, the look in her eyes, the way the riders had stood without threat or demand, and he realized that none of it had been meant to change the town by force. It had only been meant to show it something it had refused to see. Across the street, a window glowed faintly, then dimmed, then glowed again. Someone else awake, someone else turning the same thoughts over in their mind. And though no words passed between them, there was a sense now that they were no longer alone in what they carried, that something had shifted not just in one man, but in the space between them all. A breeze moved through the town, softer than the night before, carrying no strange rhythm this time, just the quiet scent of earth and wood. And yet Caleb found himself listening anyway, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if part of him had learned to hear something deeper beneath the surface of things. He stood after a while, stepping down from the porch and walking slowly toward the center of town, the boards beneath his boots creaking in familiar ways. And when he reached the well, he paused, the rope swaying slightly though no one had touched it. And for a moment he thought of drawing water again, not because it was needed, but because it had become something more than a simple act. It had become a reminder. Instead, he rested his hand against the wood and looked up, the sky wide and filled with stars, each one steady, unchanged, and it struck him then how little the world itself had altered, how the land, the sky, the distance beyond the horizon had remained exactly as it was, and that the only thing that had truly shifted was the way the town saw itself within it. Footsteps approached again, softer this time, and Caleb did not need to turn to know it was the same man from earlier, the one who had first spoken out of fear, now returning not with answers, but with something else, something closer to understanding. And when he stopped beside Caleb, he did not ask a question this time. He simply stood there, looking out at the same empty road, sharing the silence without trying to fill it. After a while, he spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain, saying that he had not realized how easy it had been to mistake quiet for weakness, and Caleb let that settle, not rushing to respond, because some truths need to sit for a moment before they are spoken aloud. When he did answer, it was simple, almost quiet enough to miss, saying that strength does not always show itself the way people expect, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stand still and let others reveal who they are. And the man nodded, not because it gave him comfort, but because it gave him something real to hold on to. The night moved on, slow and steady, and though nothing else happened, no riders returned, no voices rose from the distance. Something remained in the air, something that did not need to be seen again to be remembered. And as Caleb finally turned back toward his home, one thought settled clearly in his mind, not loud, not urgent, but certain, that the story of what had happened would not be told in the way people expected, not as a tale of fear or danger, but as a quiet moment when a town had been given the chance to see itself clearly, and for the first time, had not looked away. The next morning came without ceremony, no wind, no strange stillness, just light rising over Dry Creek the same way it always had, touching rooftops, stretching across the dust, settling into the spaces between buildings as if nothing had ever changed. And yet every man and woman who stepped outside knew better, because some mornings do not announce what they carry. They simply arrive and wait to see who has learned to see differently. Caleb Whitmore stood at the well again, not out of habit, but because it had become the only place that felt honest, the rope worn smooth beneath his hand, the bucket rising steady from the dark water below, and when it broke the surface, he paused for a moment, watching the reflection ripple, his own face shifting with the movement, unclear for a second before settling back into something familiar. And he understood then that change does not always show itself in what you become, sometimes it shows in what you can no longer pretend not to know. The town moved around him, quieter still, but not heavy anymore, not burdened in the same way. There was something lighter now, not relief, not quite, but a kind of space where thought could exist without being pushed aside, and people began to meet each other's eyes again, not long, not fully, but enough to acknowledge that something had passed between them all, something that did not need to be named to be shared. A wagon rolled slowly through the main road, its driver tipping his hat not out of routine, but with a kind of respect that had not been there before, and a woman standing near the doorway of the general store stepped aside for a stranger without hesitation, a small gesture, barely noticeable, yet It carried more meaning than any words spoken the day before. Caleb set the bucket down carefully, the water still, untouched, and for a moment he left it there, not because someone would come to take it, but because leaving it felt right, a quiet offering that asked for nothing in return, the same way it had been given before, and he turned away without looking back, because some things are not meant to be watched, they are meant to exist. Near the edge of town, the barn stood open, unchanged in shape, in structure, in every visible way, yet no one had closed its door, no one had driven new nails into its frame, and that alone spoke louder than anything else, because it meant the town had chosen, without speaking, not to repeat what had been done, not to seal something away simply because it was not understood. A child passed by it slowly, pausing for a moment at the entrance, looking inside with quiet curiosity rather than fear, and then moving on without hesitation, and that, more than anything, told Caleb what needed to be known. He walked out toward the edge of Dry Creek one last time that morning, stopping where the land opened wide and the horizon stretched beyond what any man could claim. And though there were no riders, no signs left behind, he did not feel the need to search for them anymore, because what they had brought had already been left where it mattered. He stood there in the growing warmth of the day, hat low against the sun, eyes steady, and after a long moment, he nodded once, not to anyone, not to anything visible, just a quiet acknowledgement of something understood without words. Then he turned back toward the town, toward the people who now carried that same understanding in different ways, some clear, some still forming. And as he walked, the dust rose lightly beneath his boots, the same as it always had, unchanged, familiar, and yet every step felt different, not because the ground had shifted, but because he had. And in that quiet change, something settled across Dry Creek, not loud, not spoken, but real, the kind of truth that does not need to be repeated to remain, that out here, justice does not come riding with noise or force. It arrives in silence, stands where you can see it clearly, and leaves you with nothing but the choice of who you decide to be after it is gone.